The first time she saw the dog, it was limping across the snow, blood trailing behind it like a red thread sewn into the white earth. Marianne didn't know why she opened the door. The blizzard had already bent her front gate sideways, and most folks around Bitter Creek would have shot at anything moving in a storm. But something about the way the animal looked over its shoulder, just once, before collapsing in her yard, it reminded her of something, or someone. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped onto the porch, the old boards groaning under her weight. The wind bit through the fabric and stung her cheeks, but her eyes stayed locked on the motionless lump of fur near the fence. One paw twitched, then nothing. "Damn it," she whispered. "I don't even like dogs." But that wasn't true. She hadn't liked anything much since James died, and even that wasn't entirely true either. It wasn't just his death. It was the after that had hollowed her out, the empty house, the 2 quiet mornings, the scent of his leather boots still hanging in the corner like a ghost refusing to move on. She trudged out into the snow, boots crunching, breath puffing in clouds. The dog's fur was matted with blood and burrs. One side of its ribcage rose and fell shallowly. Up close, she could see it had been shot, more than once. "You poor thing," she muttered, kneeling beside it. "What the hell happened to you?" The dog didn't answer. Of course not, but it opened one eye. Brown, deep, human brown. That was the moment she should have turned back, closed the door, pretended she hadn't seen it. But something in that look rooted her to the spot. Not fear, not even pain, just ... recognition. She didn't have a name for that feeling. Not yet. It took all her strength to lift the mutt. Inside, he was heavy, all sinew and grime. But he didn't resist. Once inside the cabin, the heat of the fire seemed to revive him a little, enough to growl low and wary as she cleaned around the wound. "Oh, hush," she scolded gently. "You already made it this far. Don't die just 'cause you're stubborn." She hadn't spoken that many words aloud in days. Marianne fetched her old sewing kit, the one with the thick black thread James used for saddles, and started to stitch the worst of the damage. It wasn't clean work, but it was steady. Her hands still remembered how to close wounds. She was halfway through when she realized she was crying. The dog watched her silently, not blinking, not even shivering. That night, after the storm calmed, and the fire crackled low, she sat across from him in the rocking chair, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm. He slept by the hearth, belly rising and falling like nothing had happened. She should have been thinking of where he came from, whose dog he was. But instead, her mind wandered. James had always wanted a dog. Said a ranch wasn't a ranch without a good dog by your side. She'd said no, always no. "We're busy enough." She used to argue, "Don't need another mouth to feed." He'd just grin and kiss the top of her head. "Well," she murmured now, glancing at the animal, "guess you got your wish after all, sweetheart." Outside, the storm had left everything soft and white and silent. But inside her little wooden house, something had changed. A little, just a little, like a window cracked open after years of dust and dark. As the fire faded to glowing embers, the dog stirred and looked at her. Not a glance, a look, measured, deep. "You got a name?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. Of course not. But Marianne felt the strangest chill run up her spine. Not from fear, from familiarity. She had seen those eyes before. Somewhere, long ago. If this story touches something in you, stick around. There's more to this dog than meets the eye, and more to Marianne's heart than even she remembers. Like and subscribe if you want to follow the rest of this quiet miracle. By morning, the storm had passed, but Marianne still hadn't slept. She sat at the edge of her bed, lacing her boots slow and tight, while the dog lay curled by the cold hearth, eyes watching every move she made. He hadn't barked, hadn't whimpered, hadn't even tried to get up, just watched her like he understood something she didn't. The cabin creaked as it always did when the snow began to melt, and beyond the frosted windows, Bitter Creek was still quiet. It would stay that way for a while. This stretch of Wyoming didn't wake up fast after a blizzard. She poured a splash of water into a tin bowl and slid it toward the dog. He sniffed, then drank, slow and silent. Marianne knelt beside him, stroking the coarse fur along his neck. Up close, she could see new things now. The scar under his left ear, old but deep, the faint silvering around his muzzle. His ears weren't quite even, as if one had been torn and healed crooked. He wasn't young, he wasn't pretty, but he was still alive. And stubborn, clearly. "You made it through the storm," she said, softly. That's something. He blinked. I guess you'll need a name. She looked out the window, the sky still pale grey and full of old sorrow. James had always said animals told you their names if you listened close enough, but Marianne didn't believe in that kind of thing. Not anymore. Still, she tried. Shadow, she asked. He didn't move. Buck, nothing. She squinted at him. How about ... Scout? At that, his ears perked slightly. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Huh, she said, sitting back on her heels. Scout it is. Then, that afternoon, she saddled her mare, a grumpy grey called Nettle, and made the slow, muddy ride into town. She hadn't planned on it, but the dog needed food, and her cupboards weren't exactly generous. She left Scout inside, with the door cracked just a finger's width. The ride into Bitter Creek was always a quiet one. 5 miles of trees and snow-dusted hills. Marianne hadn't made the trip since late fall. Too many looks, too many hushed voices. Ever since James died, folks didn't quite know what to say to her, and she didn't offer them any help. At the general store, the owner, Carl Withers, raised an eyebrow when he saw her. Marianne, he said, as if testing her name out. Well, I'll be. Thought you'd gone full ghost on us. Storms passed, she said simply. Need dog food. Some salve too, if you got any. Dog food. She nodded. You get a dog. Marianne didn't answer at first. She just looked out the window, at the low sky and the crows circling above the livery stable. Sort of, she finally said. He found me. Back at the cabin, she pushed the door open slowly, half expecting him to be gone. But Scout was still there, still watching, still breathing. He hadn't moved far from the fire, but there were wet paw prints by the back door, like he'd gotten up and walked the room, sniffing her world. Maybe checking for danger, or maybe just remembering. She fed him from her hand. He ate gently, no growling, no greed. That night, as she watched the last of the sun melt behind the white hills, Marianne thought about something James used to say. The land remembers us, even when we try to forget it. She didn't understand it back then, but sitting beside this half-dead, half-wild dog in a cabin too full of ghosts, she thought maybe she did now. Scout had come from somewhere. He had a reason. They all did, out here, and maybe he wasn't lost at all. Maybe he'd just come home. A week passed. Scout was healing faster than she expected. The stitches held, the swelling faded, and he started moving with a quiet grace, the kind of walk that said he'd once run through wild country without a fence in sight. But even as his body grew stronger, he never barked, never strayed too far from the porch, and never once tried to leave. Marianne found herself speaking to him more each day, not because she expected answers, but because the silence around her had grown too sharp over the years. And Scout, he listened, or at least, he seemed to. James would have liked you, she muttered one morning as she split wood out back, the axe biting into the stump with a thud that echoed across the hills. He had a soft spot for wanderers. Scout lay nearby, tail flicking slowly. That night, as she sat near the fire thumbing through an old book of pressed flowers James had given her on their 5th anniversary, Scout suddenly stood, stiff, alert. Then he growled, not loud, not angry, just low and long. Marianne froze. What is it, boy? Scout didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the back door. She moved slow, quiet as she could, and peeked through the window. Moonlight cast everything in silver and blue. Nothing stirred. But when she opened the door and stepped outside, she saw them, tracks, boot prints, deep ones, fresh in the mud behind the barn. Someone had been there. Watching. The next morning, she rode to Sheriff Eaton's office. The old man wasn't much help. Could have been a hunter, he said, scribbling something useless in a ledger. Or one of the McLaren boys. They liked to stir trouble this time of year. Marianne shook her head. They were too close. To the house. Eaton shrugged. You got anything missing? No. Well then, she stood there a moment, jaw tight. I buried my husband up the ridge behind our pasture. You think someone was nossing around his grave? The room went still. Eaton looked up, finally meeting her eyes. Why would anyone do that? I don't know, she said, though part of her suddenly did. The land wasn't quiet out here. Even grief made noise if you listened hard enough. As she left, the sheriff called out behind her, "Get yourself a rifle, Marianne. World ain't always as quiet as it pretends to be." Back at home, Scout met her at the gate. He didn't wag, He just stood there, steady as a post, eyes scanning the tree line. "You saw M," she whispered, "didn't you?" She didn't expect an answer, but she knelt down and cupped his face in her hands anyway. His fur was warm now, clean. The skin around the old scar twitched under her touch. "You were out there for a reason, weren't you?" she asked softly. His gaze didn't waver. That evening, just before dusk, she saddled Nettle again and rode up the ridge behind the pasture, the place James had chosen himself before the sickness took him. Said he wanted to rest where the world still felt honest. The trail was narrow, the grass brittle, the pines dusted with frost. When she reached the spot, her heart stopped. The grave was untouched, but the earth around it disturbed, not by man, by paw prints, deep ones, circling, pressed hard into the soil like something had been guarding it. Scout sat down beside the grave, calm as could be, like he'd been there before, like he'd belonged there. Marianne hadn't cried at the funeral, not when they lowered James into the cold earth, not when the preacher said his final amen, not even when the last of the neighbors rode off, leaving her alone with the wind and the silence and a bundle of dried flowers in her lap. But standing there now, beside his grave with Scout sitting, stone still at her feet, like some weathered sentinel, she felt the tears pushing behind her eyes like water against a dam. "Were you here?" she whispered. "All this time?" The ridge was quiet, except for the gentle breath of wind through the tall pines, the kind James had always called old men with secrets. She knelt and pressed her palm against the wooden marker. Just his name, James Delaney. No dates. She couldn't bring herself to carve the years. They'd meant too much. Scout moved then, just a little. He took one slow step forward and lowered his nose to the dirt, breathing deep. Then, in a gesture so strange and sacred, she felt her throat tighten. He laid down fully beside the grave, head resting against the ground like he'd done it 100 times before. Marianne backed up, heart hammering. This wasn't chance. This wasn't a stray dog with nowhere to go. He'd known this place, the path, the hill, even the way her husband had liked to sit, under the tall pine to the west, watching the sunset through the valley. She remembered something now, faint, like a ghost's whisper. One night, after supper, years ago, James had said, "Saw a dog up at the ridge today. Big fella, didn't bark, just watched me." She hadn't thought much of it then. Now her hands were trembling. That night, Marianne lit every lantern in the house. Scout didn't leave her side. She wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, just to keep her thoughts from unraveling. "James, there's a dog in our home. Maybe you sent him, maybe he sent himself. Either way, he knew where to find you. He led me there like he's done it 100 times, and I feel like a fool for not seeing it sooner. He carries something with him, not just pain, memory, loyalty, like a shadow made of bone and fur. If I'm honest, I didn't think I'd feel anything again. Not really. But this dog, he's stirring up the old parts, the ones I buried right alongside you." She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where she kept James' belt buckle and his wedding band. Scout settled beside the fire again, head on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully asleep, always listening. Always ready. 2 days later, she rode into town again, not for supplies. This time, she needed answers. At the livery, she found old Merle Bennett, who used to ride the range with James back in the early days. He looked her up and down as she tied off Nettle. "You all right, Marianne?" She swung, her leg over the saddle, boots landing in the dust. "You remember a dog, big one, brown scar on the ear, used to hang around the ridge?" Merle squinted. "You talking about the ghost dog?" "The what?" "Folks called him that," Merle said, rubbing his jaw. "Said he'd been seen sitting by that grave every day, sun up to sundown. Rain, snow, didn't matter. Some thought it was your old man's hound, but James never had a dog." Marianne shook her head slowly. "No, he didn't." "Well," Merle said, "maybe someone else thought he needed one." That night, back at the cabin, Marianne placed her old shawl on the floor beside the fire. Scout sniffed it, circled once, and laid down with a heavy sigh. She whispered into the quiet room, "I don't know where you came from, Scout, but if you're here to stay, well, then maybe I'm ready for that too." For the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. The days grew longer, snow melted into dark earth, and the creek behind the cabin began to murmur again, soft, constant, like the land itself was, slowly exhaling after a long silence. Marianne moved through her routines, but something had shifted. The stillness in the house no longer felt like a weight pressing against her ribs. It felt like space breathing room, and Scout filled it in quiet, steady ways. Never needy, never loud. She began to leave the door open during the day. He'd trot in and out, sometimes lying in the sun by the porch, sometimes wandering into the woods behind the pasture, but he always came back, always before dark. One morning, while she was tending the back fence, she heard it, a low bark. The first she'd heard from him. She looked up, startled. Scout stood at the edge of the tree line, tail stiff, ears forward. "What is it, boy?" He barked again, sharper this time, then darted into the trees. Marianne dropped her gloves and ran after him. She followed Scout through the brush, heart pounding in her chest. Her legs weren't what they used to be, but she pushed on. Branches snapped beneath her boots. Sap stuck to her sleeves. The cold hadn't fully left the earth yet, and the forest still held pockets of frost. Scout led her deeper than she'd ever gone, behind the cabin, beyond the ridge, past the hollow where deer liked to bed down in the winter. Then he stopped and sat. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Just a patch of broken branches, some rusted tin, and what looked like a fallen log wrapped in canvas. But when she stepped closer, the smell hit her. Old, sour, metallic. "Dear God," she whispered. It wasn't a log, it was a man, or what was left of one. The body had been there a while. Weeks, maybe months, judging by the state of the remains, and the revolver lying nearby. She figured he hadn't died easy. Scout didn't growl. He didn't move, just watched. Like he knew. Sheriff Eaton came out later that afternoon, along with 2 deputies and a preacher. They didn't recognize the man too far gone, but they found a badge inside his coat. Not local. Not even from Wyoming. Texas. A bounty hunter. "Guess he didn't finish his job," Eaton muttered, brushing dirt from the tin star. "Or maybe he was the job." Marianne said nothing. She just watched Scout, who stood beside the body the entire time. UNMOVING. When they carried the corpse out on a stretcher, Scout let out a low whine, the only sound of protest he gave. That night, she stared at the fire, cup of coffee in her hands, untouched. "You led me to him," she said. Scout lifted his head slightly. "You knew he was there. Maybe you were following him that day, when you got shot." She swallowed, voice growing quieter. "Were you trying to protect something, or someone?" The wind picked up outside, brushing the windows with soft fingers. She didn't sleep much. Dreams came in flickers. James standing at the ridge, the wind in his coat, pointing at something she couldn't see. Scout barking footsteps behind her. And always the feeling that something unfinished had been put to rest. The next morning, she rode to town again. This time, folks didn't look away. They nodded, even tipped their hats. Word traveled fast in a place like Bitter Creek. She picked up nails, flour, lamp oil, and, the last minute, a small, engraved tag from the blacksmith's daughter. It read simply "Scout." She fastened it to a strip of old leather and tied it gently around his neck. "There," she said. "Now you've got a name that stays." He wagged his tail once, just once, but it was enough. What do you think Scout's true story is? Let me know in the comments, and if you're feeling it in your chest the way I am, give this video a like so more folks can find their way to it. There's still more to come, and a secret waiting to be told. A week after the body was found, the ground softened enough for a proper burial. Marianne didn't attend the small service the sheriff held near the edge of town. She hadn't known the man, and she wasn't sure he deserved her prayers. But she did light a candle in the cabin that evening, and left the door cracked open while Scout sat beside her, silent and still. That night, she returned to the drawer by her bed, the one with the letter she'd written to James. She added another. This one was shorter. "James, someone came looking for something. Maybe for you, maybe for me, but Scout found him first. He brought me there, and now the woods are quiet again. I think he's guarding more than just your grave. Maybe he's guarding me, too." Spring came like a whisper, slow, shy, uncertain. The creeks filled again. The snow shrank back into the hills. Buds peeked through frostbitten soil like they were asking permission to bloom. Marianne stood on her porch one morning with a tin cup of coffee in hand, watching Scout stretch in the sun. He'd taken to sleeping on the porch now, under the swing where James used to sit with his boots up and his thoughts somewhere beyond the trees. She walked over and sat beside him. letting the wood groan under her weight. "You ever had a home before, Scout?" she asked softly. "A real one?" He glanced at her, just a flick of the eyes, but something in it settled deep. Later that week, while cleaning out the root cellar, Marianne came across an old crate of James's things: maps, saddle tools, a worn Bible, and a bundle of folded papers wrapped in oilskin. She brought it up, dusted it off, and unwrapped it at the table while Scout watched her from the doorway. Inside were half a dozen letters, all addressed to J. Delaney, but none in her handwriting, and none from Bitter Creek. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the first dot. "James, still no word from them in El Paso. I'll try Cheyenne next. You were right about keeping off the main roads. Word is, someone's hunting strangers. I've seen the same dog twice now. Big, brown, scarred. Don't know if he's following me or guarding something." Marianne sat back in her chair, heart thudding. Her eyes darted to Scout, who had quietly crept closer, now resting his head near her feet. Another letter, dated just weeks before James's death. "Brother, I ain't coming back. They're watching every station from Denver to Laramie. But I swear if I don't make it, that dog will. He's smarter than most men. I trained him like you taught me. He won't leave your side, not while there's breath in him. Trust him." Her throat closed. "Brother, Jot," she whispered it aloud. "You had a brother." James had never mentioned family, not once, not in all their years together, and she'd been too proud or too afraid to ask. She lifted the last letter, slowly, her eyes blurry now. "If this reaches you, and I don't, bury me on the hill above the pasture. Scout knows the place. He's always known." Marianne sat there long after the light had faded. The fire crackled low, casting flickers across the walls like shadows dancing to a song only the past could hear. Scout lay beside her now, his head gently resting against her boot. She whispered, "You weren't just guarding James, you were guarding his memory. All of it." He didn't move, but she saw it, a slow blink, a sigh, like even he had waited years for someone to read those words. The next day, she rode out to the ridge again. Scout trotted ahead, leading the way like he always had. She knelt beside James's grave, placed the letters in a tin box, and buried them beneath the marker. Then she said it aloud, steady, clear, "Your brother made it home. James took the long way, but he made it." Scout sat down beside her, facing the horizon. And for the first time since she lost him, Marianne felt something stir in her chest. Not grief, not ache, but peace. The days had softened. The wind still carried a chill, but there was warmth beneath it now, the kind that hinted at wildflowers under the snow, of life pressing up through soil that had known too much loss. Marianne found herself waking earlier, lighting the stove before sunrise, listening to the birds return one song at a time. Scout had taken to following her around the property, not hovering, just present, like a shadow that asked nothing, gave everything. He watched the chickens, watched the fence line, watched the hills, but most of all, he watched her. And something in that watchfulness, that loyal, unshakable gaze, began to chip away at the wall she hadn't even realized was still around her heart. One morning, she took James's old saddle off its peg. It hadn't been touched since the day she'd buried him. The leather was stiff, dust-covered, but her hands remembered how to oil it, how to work the laces and check the cinch. She carried it out to the pasture where Nettle grazed, her grey coat dappling in the morning sun. Scout followed. "You ready for a ride?" she asked him, half smiling. He wagged his tail just once, and then trotted ahead, like he already knew the way. They rode north that day, past the old mining trail and the crumbled barn where the roof had caved in years ago. James had once spoken of building something out there, a second cabin maybe, or a shelter for wintering cattle. It never happened. Life had gotten in the way, or death. Marianne stopped on a ridge that looked down across the open plains, where the grass rolled like waves under the wind. Scout stood beside Nettle, ears perked, nose to the air. "I used to come here with him," she murmured, "back when we were just figuring each other out. He'd pack apples in his saddlebag. I'd pretend I didn't notice, even though they were always for me." The memories weren't sharp anymore. They didn't stab. They unfolded. Gentle, sad, sweet, like rain on a warm roof. That night, something unexpected happened. Scout barked, not once, not out of fear, but sharp, loud, joyful. Marianne came running to the porch, startled. He was at the edge of the pasture, tail whipping the air, nose to the ground, running back and forth along a narrow stretch of grass just beyond the barn. "Scout," she called. "What's gotten into you?" He stopped suddenly, dropped low to the ground, and began to dig. Not frantic, not wild, purposeful. Marianne approached slowly. He stepped aside once she reached him, panting, his tongue lolling out. There, barely uncovered beneath layers of dirt and root, was a piece of wood. She knelt, brushed more away, and gasped. It was a small box. Old, weathered, sealed with a leather strap that had nearly rotted away. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside, a bundle of old coins, a badge with Delaney etched faintly into the back end, a folded map, drawn by hand. Its ink faded but legible. Scout sat beside her again, head tilted. Marianne stared at the items, heart pounding. This wasn't just keepsake stuff. This was hidden, buried with care. Did James know? She whispered. Or was this yours? She looked down at Scout, who had already laid his head back down, eyes half-lidded, but alert. Whatever story these objects held, he had guarded them, like he had guarded everything else. That night, Marianne spread the map on the kitchen table. The lines led north beyond Bitter Creek, past a bend in the river she hadn't ridden in years, a place marked only with one word, promise. She traced the ink with her fingertip. Scout watched from the doorway, tail thumping once. She looked at him. You want to show me something else, don't you? The wind stirred outside, the fire cracked inside, and in her chest, the old ache finally felt like it was turning into something else. Not grief, not quite hope, but something on its way there. The next morning, Marianne packed light, just a bedroll, jerky, a flask of water, and the folded map tucked into the inside pocket of James's old coat, the one that still smelled faintly of leather, pine, and years gone too fast. She saddled Nettle before the sun rose over the hills, and Scout waited near the gate, ears perked, tail still. There was no question where they were going, just a feeling in the air, quiet but steady, like a memory that hadn't been lived. Yet the ride north was rougher than she remembered. The trail hadn't been used in years. Branches clawed at her sleeves, and brush scraped the mare's legs. But they pressed on. Scout trotted ahead, never looking back, as if he'd walked that path 100 times before. By midday they reached the river bend marked on the map. Marianne slowed Nettle, scanning the trees. The water gurgled nearby, still cold and fast from mountain melt. The smell of pine sap and damp moss filled the air. Then Scout stopped. He stood near a stand of cottonwoods, tail high, body rigid. She dismounted and followed, heart thudding. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. A small cabin, abandoned, sun-bleached, half covered in ivy and brush. The roof sagged, one shutter hung crooked, but it was still standing, a shape out of the past, like a ghost too stubborn to fade. She stepped closer, her boots crunching old gravel. Scout walked ahead, nose to the ground, then circled back and sat beside the porch, like he was waiting for her to go first. Marianne pushed the door open slowly. Dust swirled in the air like it had been holding its breath for years. Inside, the cabin was bare, except for one thing, a crate in the corner nailed shut, with a strip of leather nailed across the top. Burned into the hide was a word, nearly rubbed away with time. Delaney. She stared at it for a long time. Then she opened it. Inside were journals, 4 of them, all in James's handwriting. The first was dated for years before they ever met. Back at her cabin that night, she sat by the fire with the journal in her lap, Scout lying curled at her feet. Her hands trembled as she read. The first lines aloud. June 3rd. This place ain't much to look at, but it's far enough from trouble. Me and Liam agreed we'd call it Promise. Not because it's safe, but because it's what we made to each other. That if one of us don't make it, the other keeps going, keeps quiet, keeps watching. Liam, her husband's brother, the one from the letters, the man who'd trained the dog that never left. She flipped ahead. August 12th. Scout took to the place quick. Sleeps outside the door. Won't eat till Liam does. That dog's got more loyalty than half the men we used to ride with. She glanced down at him. You always remembered, didn't you? Scout didn't move, just blinked slowly, like he understood every word. Marianne read late into the night. The journals told a story James never had, about the work he and Liam did after the war, the secrets they kept, the men they helped, and the men they couldn't, the last job that went wrong, and the vow that followed. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a hiding place for memory, a safe buried in time, and somehow, Scout had kept it, guarded it, long after both men had vanished from the world's notice. She closed the journal, hands resting on the worn cover. "I thought I'd lost everything when James died," she whispered. "But now, it feels like I'm finding parts of him I never even knew." Scout shifted slightly, pressing his back against her boot. "Warm, present, real." Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the fire glowed steady. And Marianne realized for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was remembering, and somehow, healing. The next days passed, like quiet echoes. Marianne returned to the cabin at the river bend. Promise. Every morning after feeding the hens and checking the fence line, she didn't tell anyone in town. It felt too sacred, like a secret held gently in her palms. Scout led the way every time. Sometimes he'd pause near the porch, nose lifted toward the wind, ears twitching like he heard something she couldn't. Sometimes he'd circle the clearing twice before settling, as if confirming that no shadow had crossed its peace. Inside the old cabin, she cleaned the dust away piece by piece, repaired the shutter, oiled the hinges. Each journal she read opened a new chamber in her heart. One she hadn't known was sealed shut. There was a fourth journal she hadn't dared read yet, the final one. Scout never left her side that afternoon. She sat on the edge of the crate, sunlight slanting in through the broken window. The wind outside had picked up, sending pine needles rattling across the roof like quiet footsteps. She opened the last book. James's handwriting was slower, not shaky, but thoughtful, like each word was being weighed before written. April 2nd. "If you're reading this, Marianne, then Scout finally let you hear. I figured he would. He's stubborn like Liam was, loyal like no man I've known. If he brought you to promise, it means I didn't make it. And it means he waited, just like we told him to." She blinked, a tear dropping onto the page. "I should have told you everything, but I couldn't. It wouldn't have been safe, and I couldn't bring that world into yours. You were the only piece I ever knew, the only part of me not buried under dust and fire. There's money under the floorboard. Not much, just what we saved after the last job. Use it for the ranch, for the cabin, or burn it if it makes you feel lighter." She stood, crossed the room, and lifted the loose plank under the stove. Wrapped in canvas and twine were 3 tins of coin and a letter with Liam's name on it. She pressed it to her chest. Back in her cabin that night, the fire crackled low. Marianne sat with Scout curled beside her, and the journal opened in her lap. There was one final page, and one more thing. "Scout's not just a dog, he's a promise. When Liam fell, Scout stayed by his grave until I could come back for him. When I fell, I reckon he did the same for me. You're the only person I'd trust him with. He'll stay, if you let him, or go, if you don't. But if he's by your fire now, it means he chose you. Don't forget to live, Annie, even without me, especially without me. Love always, James." She couldn't speak, could only breathe, slow and shaking, as if each word had unlocked something buried under years of quiet sorrow. Scout raised his head slightly, one ear cocked, eyes calm and knowing. "Stayed," she whispered. "All this time, you kept your promise." The dog didn't move, just pressed his chin onto her knee, eyes closing again like he'd finally found rest. And Marianne, for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, closed her eyes to not in grief, but in peace. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, first through the melting of the last snows, then the slow return of birdsong, and finally, through the soft green pushing up between cracks in the rocks around the river bend. Cabin. Marianne was there to see it all. Every morning she rode out with Scout, past the ridge and into the clearing they now called home together. She brought seeds, mended the fence, opened the shutters to let the wind sing through, and every evening she lit a fire in the same hearth where James had once written his last words. But she didn't mourn anymore, not in the old way. She remembered, now with full breath, open eyes, and a steady heart. There were still days when she'd find herself staring at the hills, wondering if James had known, in those final hours, how deeply he was loved. But she didn't need answers anymore, not with Scout sleeping at her feet, and the wind in the trees whispering old stories. One evening, she walked out past the river. Scout had stopped halfway across the clearing, standing still, alert, like he saw something she didn't. She followed his gaze and saw only the sun setting behind the far-off mountains, but she felt it, in her bones, in the earth. "James." She stepped beside Scout, laid her hand on his back. We kept our word, you and I. The dog looked up, tail thumping softly against the dirt. She knelt down. You can rest now if you want, or stay as long as you need. Either way, thank you. Scout leaned into her dot, and in that golden light, Marianne smiled, not with grief, but with something gentler, like forgiveness, like freedom. Months later, a boy from town delivered a note. It was from the sheriff's wife, asking if Marianne might help teach a few orphan girls to read. She thought of the empty cabin, the boxes of books James had collected, and the quiet joy of passing something on. She said yes, and so the woman, who had once believed her life ended with a telegram, found herself living again, not by forgetting but by honoring, not by letting go, but by letting it bloom. Scout stayed through summer, through snow, through the years that followed. His muzzle grayed, but his eyes never lost that quiet fire. He was a dog, but also a guardian, and a witness to love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little light today. And if you'd like to hear more tales from the old frontier, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive.